The scent of lukewarm coffee and stale donut crumbs lingered in the air of the precinct break room, a familiar comfort for Officer David Miller. He sat alone at a scarred formica table, his back ramrod straight, a half-eaten bagel forgotten beside his meticulously arranged thermos. Outside the grimy window, the pre-dawn glow painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray, signaling the beginning of another routine shift in the seemingly tranquil suburban town of Fairview. David's movements were precise, economical. He reached for a napkin, wiped a stray crumb from the table, his fingers moving with the same deliberate efficiency he applied to every aspect of his life. At 35, David was a pillar of the Fairview Police Department. His uniform was always crisp, his boots shined to a mirror-like gleam, his patrol car spotless. He was known for his unwavering adherence to protocol, his sharp eye for detail, and a calm demeanor that rarely faltered, even in the most chaotic situations. Colleagues respected him, albeit from a distance. There was an unspoken understanding that David was a man of his word, reliable, and utterly dedicated to his duty. Yet, this dedication often masked a profound, almost clinical sense of emotional distance that permeated his personal world. His home, a modest but meticulously kept ranch-style house on the outskirts of town, mirrored his disciplined nature. Every cushion on the sofa was fluffed, every book on the shelf aligned by height and genre. There were no superfluous knickknacks, no clutter, no vibrant splashes of color to disrupt the muted, orderly palette. Dinners were solitary affairs, usually a pre-cooked meal heated in the microwave, eaten in silence at a small kitchen table. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was often the loudest sound in the evenings, a stark contrast to the lively chaos that filled the homes of his fellow officers. David found a peculiar comfort in this solitude, a predictable peace that kept the unpredictable echoes of his past at bay. One of David's rituals, almost a sacred act, was the pre-shift cleaning of his patrol car. Even though the department had a dedicated cleaning crew, David insisted on doing it himself. He'd run a soft cloth over the dashboard, wipe down the pristine windows, and ensure every piece of equipment from the radio to the first aid kit was in its exact place. The scent of car polish and new upholstery filled the enclosed space. It was more than just maintaining equipment. It was an act of control, a small victory against the untidiness of the world, a psychological fortifying against the unforeseen. He perceived the world as inherently chaotic, and his rituals were his small, personal bulwarks against it. He rarely spoke of his personal life, not because he was secretive, but because there was little to tell. His relationships were superficial, polite, but never delving into the deep waters of shared emotions or vulnerabilities. He believed deep down that emotional entanglement only led to complications, to pain. He had witnessed enough of it in his formative years to solidify this conviction. His disciplined exterior was not merely a professional facade. It was a self-imposed fortress, designed to keep both others and himself at a safe emotional distance. He was a man who lived within the parameters he set, a life of unwavering order, yet one marked by an almost imperceptible, pervasive emptiness. The night shift crawled by with its usual cadence of quiet patrols and sporadic, minor incidents, a false alarm at a grocery store. A domestic dispute quickly de-escalated, a lost cat reunited with its frantic owner. The rain, which had threatened all day, finally began to fall around 2 a.m., a gentle drumming on the roof of David's patrol car. The deserted streets reflected the sodium glow of the streetlights, turning the asphalt into shimmering, distorted mirrors. David was passing through an older, almost rural section of the highway, where the streetlights grew sparse and the fields stretched wide on either side, unbroken by suburban sprawl. It was a stretch often used by late-night commuters trying to make good time, a shortcut around the more congested downtown areas. David's eyes, trained for the slightest anomaly, scanned the road ahead. Then he saw it, a flash of movement in the dense undergrowth beside a rusted wire fence, a distressed whimper, almost human in its anguish. David slowed his patrol car, his instincts, honed by years of observation, kicking in. He pulled over, the blue and red lights of his cruiser casting an eerie, pulsating glow on the wet street. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and stepped out, the rain instantly plastering his hair to his forehead. He pushed through the dripping branches and found a medium-sized stray dog, a scruffy terrier mix, its fur matted with mud and burrs. The dog was caught, its front paw tangled in a section of torn wire fence, struggling desperately. Its whimpers were pitiful, a blend of pain and terror. Its eyes, wide and brown, looked up at David with a mixture of fear and a desperate plea for help. The dog's struggle was silent, only the soft sounds of its choked whimpers breaking the night's quiet. David's shift change was in 20 minutes. He was off his main patrol route. Logically, he should radio for animal control and continue his duties. This was not a police matter, not strictly. But as he looked at the dog, trapped and suffering, a familiar ache bloomed in his chest. It was the same ache he felt whenever he saw something truly vulnerable, something that reminded him of a powerlessness he knew all too well from his past. He knelt, ignoring the mud soaking into his uniform trousers. "Hey there, fella," he murmured, his voice softer than usual. "Easy now. I'm gonna get you out." The dog whimpered again, trembling, but it didn't snap or try to bite. It seemed to understand that David was there to help. David carefully assessed the situation. The wire was thin but sharp, digging into the dog's paw. He needed something to cut it. His utility belt carried a multi-tool. With methodical precision, he pulled out the pliers attachment from his multi-tool. The rain continued to fall, chilling him to the bone, but David focused solely on the task at hand. He spoke to the dog in low, soothing tones, reassuring it, his voice a steady anchor in the dark, wet night. The dog watched him, its eyes never leaving his face, a glimmer of trust slowly replacing the fear. It took a good 5 minutes of careful maneuvering, the cold metal of the pliers slipping slightly in his gloved hands, but finally, with a soft snip, the wire snapped. The dog whimpered as David gently freed its paw, inspecting the small, bleeding cut. It wasn't deep, thankfully, but it would need cleaning. David carefully scooped up the trembling dog. It was surprisingly light, its bones prominent under its matted fur. He carried it back to his patrol car, placing it gently on the passenger seat, after laying down a spare blanket from his trunk. The dog shivered. Then, to David's surprise, licked his hand, a small, warm lick that sent a strange sensation through his usually guarded heart. He couldn't just leave it at the side of the road. His shift was technically almost over, but he knew of an all-night animal shelter a few miles out of his jurisdiction. He called them, explaining the situation. "I'm bringing in a stray I found," he told the dispatcher, his voice back to its usual professional tone, though a subtle undertone of warmth was present. "Got caught in a fence. Minor injury, but it needs to be checked out." He drove the dog to the shelter, a small, brightly lit building that smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet fur. He filled out the necessary paperwork, ensuring the dog would be safe and cared for. The shelter attendant, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, looked at David with quiet appreciation. "Thank you, officer. Most people would just drive by." David simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He didn't seek praise, didn't linger for thanks. Once the dog was safely handed over, he resumed his duties, heading back to the precinct for shift change. The mud on his uniform, the slight delay in his schedule, none of it mattered. A strange, quiet warmth had settled in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. This small, selfless act, performed in the dead of night, revealed the inherent kindness beneath his disciplined exterior, a quiet humanity that longed for connection, even with a lost animal. It was a crack in his carefully constructed fortress, a reminder of a tenderness he believed had long since atrophied. Back at his house, after showering off the grime and mud, David found himself unable to sleep. The warmth from the save the cat moment lingered, a pleasant but unsettling sensation. He made himself a cup of herbal tea, something he usually reserved for when he felt particularly stressed, but tonight it was a companion in his wakefulness. He walked into his bedroom, the moonlight filtering through the blinds, casting long, stark shadows across the pristine carpet. His gaze fell upon his nightstand, specifically on the small, unassuming wooden drawer on its side. He hesitated. Then, with a rare deviation from his usual rigidity, pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket from its hiding place in a velvet pouch. It wasn't something he looked at often, perhaps once or twice a year, usually when an unexpected wave of nostalgia or a recurring dream would wash over him. The locket was old, its silver worn smooth in places, and its intricate engravings dulled by time. He rarely wore it, preferring it to remain hidden, a secret relic of a life he had consciously tried to forget. He opened it with a practiced thumb and forefinger, the tiny clasp clicking softly in the silence of the room. Inside were two faded, almost indistinguishable childhood photos, barely larger than postage stamps. One was of him as a small boy, no older than 5, his face chubby, eyes wide with innocence. He was squinting slightly, as if the camera flash had surprised him. The other photo, on the opposite side of the locket, was of an older boy, perhaps 7 or 8. His face was leaner, framed by a messy mop of dark hair, and his smile was wide, full of an impish mischief. But it was his eyes that held David's gaze, striking, intense, and uncannily familiar. They were a brighter, more expressive version of his own. A flicker of pain, sharp and swift, crossed David's face, quickly followed by a familiar sense of longing, a yearning for something lost, something unresolved. The older boy in the photo was Ethan, his older brother. Ethan had vanished when David was 10. Their family had fractured, then shattered, under the weight of unspoken resentments and the harsh realities of a life that offered little comfort. Ethan, always the wilder, more rebellious of the two, had simply disappeared one day, leaving behind only rumors and a gaping hole in David's young life. David had built his disciplined life partly as a reaction to that chaos, a way to ensure he would never lose control or be vulnerable again. He rarely allowed himself to dwell on it. The locket was a small, physical tether to a past he mostly kept locked away. He closed the locket, the click of the clasp echoing the closure he tried to impose on his emotions. He slipped it back into its velvet pouch and returned it to the locked drawer, his movements once again precise, almost ritualistic. Yet, tonight, the images lingered. The warmth from the dog's lick, the small, bleeding cut on its paw, the silent trust in its eyes, all seemed to intertwine with the faded photos of Ethan. There was a pervasive sense of emptiness despite his professional fulfillment. He found comfort in the predictability of his job, but a part of him yearned for something more, a connection he couldn't quite articulate, a missing piece that his disciplined life hadn't filled. He often dreamt of a blurred face, a voice he couldn't quite recall, leaving him with a sense of unease. Tonight, the face felt less blurred, the voice almost audible, the seed of mystery. The hidden talent for empathy that had manifested with the dog was beginning to stir something deeper. The quiet before the storm was becoming restless, a subtle tremor beneath the surface of his ordered world. The night, already deep in its quietude, seemed to hold its breath over Fairview. Officer David Miller's patrol car, a silent guardian against the encroaching darkness, glided along the deserted stretches of Highway 17. The faint hum of the engine and the occasional static burst from the radio were the only sounds disturbing the profound stillness. It was past 3 a.m., the hour when the town truly slept, and the world outside the cruiser's tinted windows felt like a vast, empty canvas. David found a peculiar comfort in this solitude, the predictable monotony, a soothing balm to the subtle unease that had stirred within him since his encounter with the stray dog and the reemergence of Ethan's faded image. His mind, usually a fortress of logical deductions, drifted, occasionally revisiting the unsettling sense of emptiness that seemed to cling to him despite his professional accomplishments. He was passing through an older, almost rural section of the highway, where the streetlights grew sparse and the fields stretched wide on either side, unbroken by suburban sprawl. It was a stretch often used by late-night commuters trying to make good time, a shortcut around the more congested downtown areas. David's eyes, trained for the slightest anomaly, scanned the road ahead. Then he saw it. A car, a sleek, older model, perhaps a classic in the making, but moving with a speed that was undeniably excessive for the posted limit. It wasn't just fast. It was weaving slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible sway that hinted at either recklessness or fatigue. The car's taillights, bright red against the dark asphalt, seemed to dance across the road as it sped into the distance. Out-of-state plates, David noted instinctively, catching the glint of a distant state logo. A jolt of professional instinct, cold and precise, coursed through him. This was not merely a speeding vehicle. The erratic movement suggested a potential hazard. His hand, without conscious thought, went to the console. The flick of a switch, and the highway was suddenly bathed in the pulsating blue and red of his emergency lights. The wail of his siren, sharp and urgent, tore through the silence, shattering the tranquil night. The speeding car, alerted, straightened its course abruptly and began to slow, its brake lights flaring in protest. David followed protocol, maintaining a safe distance as the vehicle pulled over to the shoulder, its tires crunching on loose gravel. He slowed his cruiser to a stop a few car lengths behind, angling it slightly to provide maximum visibility and protection. The car was a vintage Mustang, a deep forest green, showing signs of wear but still possessing a defiant elegance. The out-of-state plates confirmed his initial observation. Before even stepping out, David reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I'm initiating a traffic stop on Highway 17 southbound. Vehicle is a green Mustang, out-of-state plates. Tag number G Sierra 47 Bravo N3 Charlie. Speeding and erratic driving. Running plates now." His voice was calm, professional, betraying none of the subtle undercurrent of unease that had begun to prickle at his skin. He waited for the dispatch to acknowledge, then clicked the radio off. His eyes, fixed on the stopped Mustang, narrowed slightly. There was something about the way the driver had hesitated, the slow, almost reluctant manner in which the car had pulled over. That raised a quiet alarm. A standard traffic stop, yes, but something felt off. The data from the license plate returned within seconds, flashing on his patrol car's computer screen. David's gaze swept over the information: vehicle make, model, year, registered owner, and then the name. Ethan Miller. A jolt, sharper and more electric than the one from activating his siren, shot through David. His breath hitched. Ethan Miller. The name echoed in the confined space of his cruiser, reverberating with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. He dismissed it instantly. Miller was a common name. Ethan was a common name. It was a coincidence. A simple, undeniable coincidence. He was in a different state, miles from where his life with Ethan had ended. It couldn't be. But even as his logical mind tried to rationalize, a primal instinct, deep and unsettling, began to pound in his chest. His heart, usually as steady and methodical as a metronome, began to hammer against his ribs with an inexplicable urgency. A cold sweat pricked at his forehead beneath the brim of his patrol cap. This wasn't just a common name. This felt different. He reached for his flashlight and his ticket book, his movements now slightly less fluid, a subtle tremor in his hands. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure, to push down the rising tide of irrational fear and a long-dormant hope that threatened to overwhelm his disciplined exterior. He had a job to do. This was a traffic stop. Nothing more. As he stepped out of his patrol car, the heavy thud of the door closing behind him echoing in the night, the rain intensified, turning into a steady downpour. It plastered his uniform to his skin, chilled him to the bone. But David barely noticed. All his senses were focused on the green Mustang ahead. He approached cautiously, his hand resting lightly on his sidearm, a standard procedure. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the driver's side window. The window began to lower, slowly, almost reluctantly, with a soft whirring sound. Piece by piece, the interior of the Mustang, dark and indistinct, began to reveal itself. The silhouette of the driver, initially just a shape, began to gain definition. A head, slightly angled away from him. A shoulder, the curve of a jawline. And then, as the window completed its descent, revealing the driver's profile in the faint glow of the dashboard lights and the pulsating red of David's cruiser, time seemed to stretch, distort, then snap. The man in the driver's seat, his hair, a darker shade of brown than David's own, was damp and slightly disheveled. A 5 o'clock shadow darkened his jaw. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of weariness, perhaps hardship. But those eyes, they were the same striking, intense eyes from the faded photo in his locket. A brighter, more expressive version of his own, now dulled by age and fatigue, but undeniably familiar. The same high cheekbones, the same slight curve of the nose. It was a profile David hadn't seen in over 2 decades, a face he had consciously tried to erase from his memory. A physical blow, sharp and instantaneous, hit David in the gut. The air seemed to rush out of his lungs. His flashlight, which he had been holding steady, trembled almost imperceptibly in his hand. The ticket book slipped from his grasp, falling silently onto the wet asphalt. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a common name. It was him. Ethan, his long-lost older brother, sitting in the driver's seat of a speeding car, stopped by his own hand, under the authority of the badge he wore. The irony was brutal, a punch to the gut that left him breathless. The carefully constructed walls of David's life, the order, the predictability, the emotional distance, they shattered in that instant, crumbling around him like dust. The world tilted on its axis, and the past, which he had meticulously buried, had just crashed violently, irrevocably, into his present. This unexpected, shocking reunion, under the most official and surreal circumstances, marked an irreversible turning point. David knew, with an absolute, terrifying certainty, that his life will never, ever be the same. The future, once a clear, straight path, had just veered wildly into the unknown, driven by the ghost of a past he had always tried to outrun. The routine patrol, the simple speeding ticket, had just become the most profound and unsettling moment of his entire existence. The rain, relentless and cold, poured down from the bruised night sky, mirroring the torrent of chaos that had just unleashed itself in Officer David Miller's meticulously ordered life. The ticket book, now a forgotten, soggy mess on the wet asphalt, lay at his feet, a testament to the abrupt halt of his routine patrol. His flashlight beam, which moments ago had cut through the darkness with sterile precision, now shook almost imperceptibly in his trembling hand, its light dancing across the face of the man in the driver's seat, a face he knew, yet simultaneously did not. Ethan, the name, silent on David's lips, roared in his mind. 2 decades of buried memories, of carefully constructed walls, collapsed in an instant. This wasn't a coincidence, a common name, a trick of the light. This was his brother, his older brother, whom he had mourned in the quiet corners of his heart, whom he had erased from his present, and whom he now confronted under the harsh, pulsating glow of his patrol car's emergency lights. The irony was a cruel, sharp blade twisting in his gut. He was a police officer, bound by duty and law, yet he stood before a ghost from his past, a ghost that was flesh and blood, caught in the very act he was sworn to prevent. Ethan Miller, sitting behind the wheel of the vintage Mustang, squinted slightly against the flashlight beam. His eyes, though weary, held a defiant glint that David remembered vividly. He appeared older, hardened, lines of fatigue etched around his eyes and mouth, a rough beard shadowing his jaw. His clothes, though clean, seemed to belong to a life of hard work, far from the clean-cut images of success David often encountered. Ethan didn't seem to recognize David immediately, or perhaps he was simply feigning ignorance, a skill David knew his brother possessed in spades. "License and registration, please." David managed to articulate, his voice strained, a raw, unfamiliar rasp. He tried to inject his usual professional tone, but it emerged flat, devoid of its customary authority. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple, mixing with the raindrops. The dash cam in his patrol car, a silent, unblinking eye, hummed softly, faithfully recording every surreal second of this interaction. It captured the tremor in David's hand, the almost imperceptible widening of his eyes, the subtle shift in his usually rigid posture, details that would escape a casual observer, but not a trained one. Or, crucially, the discerning eye of the reader. Ethan's hand, calloused and rough, slowly reached for his wallet in the inner pocket of his worn jacket. His movements were cautious, almost defensive, as if expecting hostility. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, its edges frayed, and presented a driver's license. "Here you go, officer." His voice was low, raspy, a stranger's voice, yet there was a familiar timbre, a cadence that struck a chord deep within David's memory. David took the license. His fingers brushed Ethan's, and a jolt, a phantom echo of childhood touch, shot through him. The name on the license, undeniably Ethan Miller, stared back at him. The address was from a state hundreds of miles away, confirming the out-of-state plates. David looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze. He had to break through. He couldn't just issue a ticket and let him disappear again. Not after all these years. "Do you know why I pulled you over, Mr. Miller?" David asked, his voice still tight, trying to maintain some semblance of official distance. Ethan shrugged, a dismissive gesture David remembered from their youth. "Speeding, I guess. Thought I was clear out here." There was a weariness in his tone, a resignation that spoke of countless encounters with authority. David's mind raced. How to do this? How to reveal himself without causing a scene, without making a public spectacle of their shattered history? He couldn't simply say, "I'm your brother." Not here. Not like this. He needed to find a subtle key, a shared memory, a private language. "Highway 17. David began, his voice taking on a slightly different cadence, a softer edge. "Always seemed like the fastest way to get where you were going, even when we were kids." Ethan's eyes, which had been fixed on the road ahead, flickered towards David, a flicker of recognition, a slight narrowing, then a widening. His brow furrowed. He recognized the words, perhaps the tone, the shared memory. It was an old inside joke, a secret path they used to take to their childhood fishing spot. David took a risk, leaning slightly closer, lowering his voice, yet ensuring the dash cam still captured his face. "And you always said," David continued, his voice barely a whisper, a voice laden with 2 decades of unspoken longing, "that the fastest way isn't always the safest way, Davy. Remember that, Ethan." Ethan froze. His body, which had been tense, suddenly went rigid, then sagged as if the air had been let out of him. The name, Davy. A childhood nickname only Ethan had used, hung in the rainy night, a ghost conjured by David's words. The composure he had maintained, the carefully constructed indifference, crumbled. His eyes, wide with shock, finally truly saw David. Not the officer, but the boy, the brother, Davy. Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief, a tremor running through it. His face, etched with weariness, now contorted into an expression of profound shock. Then a dawning comprehension mixed with a flicker of raw, unadulterated fear. "No, it can't be. You're a cop." "It's me. Ethan," David confirmed, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain, the words a raw confession. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, opening it and flashing the faded photos towards Ethan, just for a second. "It's David." Ethan stared at the locket, then back at David, his eyes scanning David's face, searching for the familiar contours of the boy he had left behind, now covered by the stern lines of a man in uniform. A wave of emotions crossed his face: shock, denial, a flash of something akin to resentment, and then a flicker of pain, mirroring David's own. The dramatic irony was profound. The reader knew David's internal struggle, witnessed Ethan's dawning, reluctant realization, caught on film by the impassive dashcam. Just then, a voice crackled over David's radio. "Unit 34, everything okay? You've been on stop for a few minutes." It was Sergeant Sarah Jenkins, David's direct superior, her voice calm but questioning. David quickly brought the radio to his mouth, his mind racing. He couldn't explain this over the air. "Negative. Sergeant, everything's fine. Just a bit of paperwork. I'll be clear shortly." He glanced at Ethan, a silent plea in his eyes for compliance. Ethan, however, was already displaying his initial adversarial stance. As the realization solidified, a wave of discomfort, mixed with old resentments, washed over him. He was trapped by his own brother, a police officer. It was the ultimate betrayal of their unspoken bond, the culmination of everything he had tried to escape. "Paperwork," Ethan scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "What, gonna give your long-lost brother a ticket? Davy, after all this time?" His voice was laced with sarcasm, his eyes hardening with a defiant glint. He pulled his hands back, clutching the steering wheel as if preparing to flee. "Look, I gotta go. Just give me the ticket. Whatever. I'll pay it." He tried to roll up the window, a desperate attempt to close off the conversation, to retreat back into the shadows from which he had emerged. David quickly placed a hand on the window frame, stopping it. "Ethan, wait. We need to talk." His voice was firm, but the plea was evident. "Talk about what?" Ethan retorted, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, as if searching for an escape route. "The good old days before you became this." He gestured vaguely at David's uniform, a clear disdain in his eyes. He attempted to dismiss their shared past, to make a cutting remark about David's choice of profession, implying a betrayal of their roots. He then tried to quickly leave the scene, his desire to escape the situation overwhelming any nascent desire for reconnection. "Ethan, you were speeding," David stated, regaining some of his professional composure, though his voice was still raw. "And your car was weaving. Are you all right? Have you been drinking?" His question was professional, but under it lay a deep, personal concern. Ethan flinched at the insinuation, his jaw tightening. "I'm fine. Just tired. Look, I don't want any trouble. Just let me go." There was a desperate urgency in his tone, a clear unwillingness to confront their fractured relationship, or the circumstances that had led him to this point. The rain continued to fall, washing over the two brothers, one bound by the law, the other by a shadowed past. David knew this was just the beginning. The initial confrontation had torn open an old wound, revealing the raw, festering resentments that had festered for 2 decades. Ethan's resistance was a clear signal of the battle ahead. David's duty as an officer clashed violently with his desperate yearning as a brother. He had found Ethan, but the road to reconciliation, if it existed at all, would be fraught with pain and unspoken words. The ghost in the headlights was real, and it was demanding to be confronted. The rain had finally ceased, leaving the city streets gleaming with a wet, cold sheen under the emerging streetlights. But the internal storm raging within Officer David Miller was far from over. The encounter with Ethan on Highway 17 had ripped open a wound David had believed long healed, a chasm in his life he had meticulously papered over with routine and discipline. Now, the gaping emptiness of that chasm was all he could feel. He had let Ethan go, unable to process the shock, unwilling to make a public arrest of his own brother, leaving the traffic stop unresolved, but the personal confrontation undeniable. His shift ended in a blur. He clocked out, his mind elsewhere, barely registering Sergeant Jenkins's concerned glance. Back in his meticulously clean house, the order he had so desperately cultivated felt like a cruel mockery. He moved through the familiar motions of his evening routine, showering, changing into comfortable clothes, making a simple meal. But each action was mechanical, devoid of his usual precise focus. His thoughts spun in a turbulent vortex. Ethan, the speeding Mustang, the hardened lines on his brother's face, the bitter scorn in his voice. David knew, with absolute certainty, that he couldn't let Ethan disappear again. The 20 years of silence had been a self-imposed purgatory, a life lived with a crucial piece missing. Now that piece had resurfaced, bruised and defiant, and David felt an almost visceral need to understand, to reconnect. His duty as a police officer suddenly seemed secondary to the overwhelming pull of blood. The next day, officially off duty, David embarked on his solitary pursuit. He started with the basics, using his police resources discreetly, carefully, ensuring no red flags were raised. The out-of-state plate provided an initial lead. The Mustang was registered to a small, unincorporated address hundreds of miles away, a desolate-sounding rural route in a state known for its transient populations and struggling economies. It confirmed his suspicion that Ethan's life was far from stable. The arena for David's desperate search became the city's underbelly, the dilapidated corners and forgotten neighborhoods that existed far from Fairview's manicured lawns and quiet streets. David, usually patrolling the suburban calm, found himself in places that reeked of decay, of forgotten dreams and hard living. He drove his personal car, a nondescript sedan, through cracked asphalt streets lined with boarded-up storefronts and flickering neon signs. These places, grim and unyielding, mirrored the brokenness of their past, the fractured landscape of their family. He started with pawn shops, then dive bars, then soup kitchens, places where desperation often led. He showed an old, slightly more recent photo of Ethan, taken years ago, perhaps from an online public record search, a mugshot, perhaps, or a blurry social media picture he'd found. He spoke to bartenders, shelter workers, even other transients, always careful, always cautious, never revealing his true identity or his desperate personal stake. He presented himself as a private investigator looking for a distant relative, a cover story vague enough to avoid too many questions. The leads were scarce, frustratingly so. Ethan was like a ghost, leaving only faint traces. A bartender might remember a man who paid in cash, always quiet. A shelter worker might recall a brief stay, a name scrawled on a register. Each fragment of information painted a bleaker picture of Ethan's life, transient, struggling, always on the move. There were whispers of odd jobs, manual labor, sometimes hints of desperate measures to make ends meet. David even heard a vague mention of bad company, of connections to a local low-level drug scene, a chilling detail that twisted his gut. This relentless, solitary pursuit intensified David's isolation. At the precinct, Sergeant Jenkins, ever observant, noticed David's uncharacteristic distraction. His sharp focus had blurred, his usual efficient demeanor replaced by a brooding intensity. "Miller," she said one afternoon, finding him staring blankly at a cold cup of coffee in the break room. "Everything all right? You seem a bit distant lately." Her tone was gentle, tinged with genuine concern. David merely nodded. Just a lot on my mind, Sergeant. Case I'm working on. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. The personal stakes were too high. The potential consequences to his career, to his meticulously built reputation, too great. Later, she approached him again, her voice softer, more like a mentor than a superior. Look, David, I know you're a dedicated officer, but sometimes you gotta know when to let go. We can't fix everything. You focus too much on things you can't control. It'll eat you alive. Her words, meant as advice, felt like a direct warning against his current personal quest. They were a reminder of his isolation, reinforcing the idea that this burden was his alone to bear. His attempts to reach out to extended family members were equally fruitless. Their parents had passed away years ago, the family fractured and scattered long before. A few distant aunts and uncles, whom he hadn't spoken to in years, answered his calls with distant politeness, offering vague condolences for Ethan's disappearance, but no real leads or emotional support. Ethan was always difficult, David, one aunt had sighed over the phone. Best just to let him be. Some people just don't want to be found. Their words, meant to offer closure, only deepened David's conviction that he was utterly alone in this quest for reconciliation. He wrestled with the profound conflict between his sworn duty as an officer and the desperate, almost irrational need to reconnect with his long-lost brother. The law, so clear in his professional life, blurred into a confusing morass when applied to his own blood. The frustration was a constant, gnawing ache. He was David Miller, the officer who solved cases, who brought order to chaos. But here, chasing fragments of his own past, he felt utterly powerless. His investigative prowess, so effective in police work, seemed to fail him when applied to the evasive ghost of his brother. Then came the chilling discovery that escalated the time pressure. David finally found an old acquaintance of Ethan's, a man named Jesse, a former mechanic who now worked odd jobs in the seedier parts of the city. Jesse, a weary man with kind eyes, recognized Ethan's photo immediately. Ethan, yeah, I know Ethan, Jesse said, his voice low, glancing nervously over his shoulder. He's in some trouble, man. Big trouble. David's heart clenched. What kind of trouble? Jesse hesitated, wringing his hands. He owes money. To some real bad dudes. A crew that operates out of the old industrial district. They don't play around. I heard they gave him a deadline. If he don't pay up by the end of the week, they're gonna make an example of him. And he ain't got it. He's been looking rough, too. Coughing a lot. Like he ain't taking care of himself. A deadline. The end of the week. The words slammed into David, transforming his private quest into a desperate race against time. This wasn't just about reconciliation anymore. It was about saving Ethan's life. The subtle health concerns, the coughing a lot, hinted at a deeper, deteriorating condition. The unsavory characters Ethan owed money to became the tangible, immediate threat. David felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. His brother was not just lost, he was in immediate peril. He couldn't call the police. That would put Ethan in even more danger, possibly behind bars. This was on him. He had to act quickly, before Ethan disappeared again, or worse. The gauntlet had been thrown, and David was alone in the arena, facing not just his brother's resentment, but a deadly ticking clock. His career, his safety, even his life, were now on the line. The deadline loomed like a thundercloud on the horizon, the end of the week. Every tick of the clock was a hammer blow to David Miller's conscience, a stark reminder of Ethan's precarious position. The gauntlet of Chapter 4, the relentless, lonely search through the city's forgotten corners, had led him not to a simple reconciliation, but to a desperate race against time to save his brother's life. The subtle health concerns Jesse had mentioned, the coughing a lot, gnawed at David, fueling a terrifying sense of urgency. David found himself operating on sheer adrenaline and a primal, unwavering resolve. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. His mind, usually so structured, was now a whirlwind of strategies, each one discarding the last as too slow, too risky, or too likely to alienate Ethan further. He still couldn't involve the department directly. Bringing in uniformed officers would likely send Ethan deeper into hiding. Or worse, put him directly into a cell. This was a personal mission, fraught with professional peril. His first crucial move was to utilize his unique skills as a police officer, not for an arrest, but for a rescue. He tapped into his investigative prowess, meticulously piecing together the fragments of Ethan's life he had uncovered. He accessed databases discreetly, cross-referencing names Jesse had mentioned with known low-level criminal elements operating in the old industrial district. He even, reluctantly, activated an old, rarely used network of street informants he'd cultivated over the years. Subtle whispers in the underbelly of the city, asking for any information on a green Mustang or Ethan, the mechanic. These discreet inquiries were a calculated risk, a potential career ender if discovered. But the thought of losing Ethan again, perhaps permanently this time, outweighed any fear of professional reprisal. The information slowly trickled in, painting a grim but clearer picture. Ethan had indeed been pulled into a circle of petty criminals, owing money to a small but violent crew known for their ruthlessness, led by a man named Cutter. Ethan's health was deteriorating. He was indeed battling a persistent cough and a deep-seated addiction to painkillers, a habit he'd picked up after a series of untreated injuries from his grueling manual labor jobs. He was spiraling, trapped between his debt and his dependence. David felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. Where had he been? How could he have been so blind, so absent? Armed with this knowledge, David knew he couldn't just confront Ethan directly about the debt or the addiction. His brother's pride, always fierce, would resist any perceived charity or intervention. He had to be subtle, to offer assistance without making it feel like a handout, to connect without judgment. This was the Boklo Trong Teen the Bat Jacques D for David's compassion. He started by anonymously sending an email to a local nonprofit that specialized in finding employment for ex-offenders and individuals experiencing homelessness, highlighting Ethan's skills as a mechanic. He provided details about Ethan's past, carefully omitting any mention of their familial connection, portraying it as a case he'd stumbled upon. He also discreetly funded a few weeks of rent at a sober living facility under a fictitious name, just enough to give Ethan a safe space if he chose to take it. He left an anonymous flyer for a local support group at a soup kitchen Ethan was known to frequent. These were David's crucial moves, carefully orchestrated behind the scenes. Ethan, despite his tough exterior and the bitter resentment he harbored for David, began to show small cracks in his resolve. He found the anonymous job lead, a genuine interview at a small, reputable garage seeking a skilled mechanic. He also found the flyer for the support group, and, in a moment of utter desperation, even visited the sober living facility, though he didn't check in. His internal conflict was a raging battle. His pride screamed defiance. His long-standing resentment of David simmered, yet a desperate longing for connection and help, a quiet yearning for a life free from the endless struggle, gnawed at him. He battled his inner demons, the addiction that whispered false promises of escape, the feeling of worthlessness that had plagued him since their parents' deaths. He almost accepted the job, almost checked into the facility, but then, the old familiar fear of commitment, of being vulnerable, pulled him back. The weight of his past mistakes, the feeling that he didn't deserve a better life, held him captive. This emotional tug-of-war was agonizing for David to witness from afar. He saw Ethan's flicker of hope, followed by his inevitable retreat. He needed help, someone who could reach Ethan in a way he couldn't. And then he thought of Sergeant Jenkins. It was a risky move, one that could jeopardize his entire career. But David was desperate. He found Sergeant Jenkins in her office late one night, poring over cold cases. He closed the door behind him, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs. "Sergeant," David began, his voice low, betraying the unusual tremor in his hands. "I need to talk to you. Privately. About something personal." Sergeant Jenkins looked up, her expression shrewd, her eyes immediately sensing the gravity of the situation. She gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "What's on your mind?" "Miller." Her voice was calm, reassuring. David hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, began to speak. He revealed everything: the locket, the lost brother, the traffic stop, Ethan's current situation, the unsavory characters, the deadline. He showed her the faded photo of Ethan. He spoke of his guilt, his regret, the emptiness he had carried for 2 decades. He laid bare his most painful past, turning his mentor into his helper. Sergeant Jenkins listened, her face impassive, her gaze unwavering. When David finished, the silence in the room was thick with unspoken emotions. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the distant wall. "David," she said finally, her voice soft but firm, "you know the risks you're taking. Your job. Everything." "I know, Sergeant," David replied, his voice hoarse. "But I couldn't just let him go. Not again." She nodded slowly. "No. I suppose you can't." She picked up a pen, twirling it between her fingers. "So, what do you need from me?" She didn't judge. She didn't condemn. She simply offered her support, her wisdom, her quiet strength. This was the moment of David's vulnerability, the bok lo trong tin the bat jak di for his emotional state. Sergeant Jenkins became his helper, now fully aware of the stakes. Just as David began to feel a glimmer of hope, the antagonist's last attempt occurred. Plunging Ethan into deeper peril, Cutter's crew, growing impatient with Ethan's evasiveness and lack of payment, made their move. David, through his informants, received a frantic tip Cutter's men had found Ethan. They had cornered him in a derelict warehouse in the old industrial district, the very heart of their operation, demanding payment. If he didn't produce the money by midnight, they would make an example of him. They planned to draw him into a dangerous, high-stakes drug deal to settle his debt, a scheme that would undoubtedly end in his arrest or worse. The time pressure was now immediate, brutal. It wasn't just a deadline, it was a matter of hours. This direct threat acted as the ultimate catalyst, putting Ethan's life in immediate, undeniable danger. David called Sergeant Jenkins, his voice tight with urgency. "Sergeant, it's Ethan. They have him. Old Industrial District. Warehouse on Elm Street. He's in trouble." He gave her the bare facts, knowing she would understand the unspoken plea. Sergeant Jenkins didn't hesitate. "Understood. Miller, don't go in alone. I'm mobilizing a unit now. Stay put until we get there." Her voice was calm, authoritative, cutting through David's panic. But David knew he couldn't wait. Every second counted. He knew Ethan's pride, his fear. If the police arrived in force, Ethan would resist, flee, or be irrevocably lost to the system. This was his chance, perhaps his only chance to reach his brother. Man to man, brother to brother, before the law or the criminals, consumed him. He pulled out his personal handgun, tucking it into his waistband, and grabbed a small, heavy-duty flashlight. He wasn't going in as Officer Miller. He was going in as David. His career, his safety, even his life, were now on the line. The weight of unspoken words, of 2 decades of separation, pressed down on him. The climax was inevitable, and David was ready to face it, alone if he had to. The old industrial district was a skeletal landscape of rusted metal and crumbling brick, swallowed by the insatiable maw of the night. Rain, a relentless and chilling torrent, lashed down, turning the unpaved roads into muddy rivers and obscuring the already scarce visibility. Each flash of lightning ripped through the sky, momentarily illuminating the derelict warehouses that squatted like forgotten monsters in the urban decay. It was a setting that perfectly embodied the chaos and brokenness of Ethan's life. A dangerous, unforgiving arena for the inevitable climax. Officer David Miller. No longer just Officer Miller, but simply David, navigated the treacherous terrain in his personal car, its tires splashing through puddles. His uniform was replaced by dark, nondescript clothing, his patrol vest by a simple, heavy jacket. The handgun he had tucked into his waistband felt cold against his skin, a stark reminder that he was operating outside the protective embrace of his badge, driven solely by the desperate, primal instinct of a brother. The radio call to Sergeant Jenkins had been a calculated risk, a desperate plea for backup that might arrive too late. He knew Ethan's pride, his fear of authority, the certainty that if uniformed officers burst in, his brother would fight, flee, or be lost forever to the system he so deeply mistrusted. This was his chance, perhaps his only one, to reach Ethan. Man to man, brother to brother, before the law, or the criminals, consumed him. He spotted the warehouse on Elm Street, a vast, decaying structure with most of its windows shattered, gaping black holes in its grimy facade. A single, weak bulb flickered above a rusting metal door, casting an anemic glow. A battered, dark sedan, a model known to be favored by Cutter's crew, was parked carelessly outside. David cut his engine, coasting silently into the shadows of an adjacent, equally derelict building. The drumming of the rain on his car roof was deafening, yet he could hear his own heart pounding, a frantic drumbeat in the desolate night. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, its beam a reassuringly solid column of light in the oppressive darkness. He moved cautiously, his police training kicking in, blending with the shadows, using the environment to his advantage. He approached the warehouse door, sensing rather than seeing the tension that radiated from within. Muffled voices, harsh and guttural, filtered through the corroded metal. He pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The vast interior of the warehouse was a cavern of gloom, illuminated sporadically by bare, swinging bulbs that cast dancing, distorted shadows. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete, rust, and something acrid, perhaps stale cigarettes and fear. In the center of the cavernous space, a small group of men stood, silhouetted against the weak light. Cutter, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a brutal, impassive face, stood directly in front of Ethan. Two of his enforcers flanked him, their arms crossed, their expressions menacing. Ethan. He looked even worse than David had feared. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale and drawn, a thin sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cold. His old jacket was torn, and he clutched his side, a dark stain spreading slowly on the fabric. He was clearly injured, vulnerable, cornered. The cough Jesse had mentioned racked his body, a hacking sound that echoed in the vast space. "You got the money." Miller Cutter's voice was a low growl, devoid of patience. "Midnight's passed. Time's up." He held a small, clear plastic bag in his hand, filled with a white powder. "Or maybe you're more interested in a different kind of payment. We got a job for you, a big one. Move this package, and your debt is cleared. No questions asked." Ethan shook his head, a desperate, defiant gesture. "I told you, Cutter. I'm out. I'm not doing that. I'll get you the money. Just give me more time." His voice was hoarse, strained, a desperate plea that fell on deaf ears. "Time's a luxury you don't have anymore, buddy." One of Cutter's enforcers snarled, stepping forward, his hand going to a heavy wrench tucked into his belt. "You either work for us, or you pay the price." David saw the raw fear in Ethan's eyes, the way his brother braced himself for an inevitable blow. He couldn't wait. He couldn't let Ethan be dragged deeper into this, or worse, be hurt. This was the bated breath moment, where everything hung precariously in the balance. David knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, but he moved anyway, driven by an instinct beyond logic or training. He burst through the metal door, his heavy boots echoing loudly on the concrete floor. "Police don't move," he roared, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the empty warehouse, a primal sound that was part command, part desperate plea. His flashlight beam, now held steady, swept across the faces of Cutter and his men, blinding them momentarily. Cutter and his enforcers froze, startled. Ethan, too, flinched, his head snapping up, his eyes widening in disbelief as he saw David, not in uniform, but with the unmistakable authority of a man who knew how to command. "Who the hell are you?" Cutter snarled, recovering quickly, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. He saw David's personal clothes, no badge visible. "You ain't no cop." "I said, don't move," David repeated, advancing steadily, his eyes fixed on Cutter. His hand went to the small handgun tucked into his waistband, a subtle but clear threat. He pulled it out, holding it low, but aimed. This was not a standard police encounter. This was a brother protecting his own. One of Cutter's enforcers, quicker than the others, lunged forward, reaching for the wrench. David reacted with the speed of a trained officer, but fueled by a brother's desperation. He sidestepped the lunge, pivoting smoothly. His free hand shot out, grabbing the enforcer's wrist, twisting it sharply, a yelp of pain. David used the enforcer's momentum, pushing him into Cutter. Both men stumbled, briefly disoriented. "Ethan, get out of here," David yelled, his voice raw. Ethan, initially paralyzed by shock, finally stirred. He saw the genuine terror in Cutter's eyes, the unexpected skill in David's movements. His hardened facade began to crack. He was no longer just seeing a cop. He was seeing his brother, risking everything for him. Cutter, enraged, lunged at David, his face contorted in a snarl. He was a bigger man, heavier, and clearly more accustomed to brute force. David met him head-on, not with brute force, but with agility and cunning. He ducked under Cutter's wild swing, spinning to get behind him, using the environment to his advantage. He kicked a stack of empty pallets, sending them crashing down, creating a momentary diversion and a barrier. The distraction bought him precious seconds. As Cutter struggled to regain his footing, David took a calculated risk. He quickly brought his hand to his ear, pretending to activate a hidden earpiece, and loudly, clearly, spoke into the rain-filled air. "Unit 34 to dispatch. We have a confirmed 1054 multiple suspects. Armed in the warehouse on Elm Street, officer under fire, request immediate backup. All available units." It was a bluff, a desperate gamble, but his voice carried the conviction of command. He knew Sergeant Jenkins was on her way, but he needed to buy time, to make Cutter believe he was already surrounded. Cutter froze. His enforcers, who had been moving in, hesitated, glancing nervously at each other. The word "armed" and "all available units" clearly got their attention. They were low-level thugs, not hardened criminals willing to face a full police response. "It's a trap, boss," one of the enforcers hissed, his eyes darting towards the door. "You set us up, you bastard," Cutter snarled at Ethan, blaming him, then turned his furious gaze back to David. "You'll regret this, cop." But their bravado was already dissolving into panic. They looked less like menacing figures and more like cornered rats. The weight of David's authority, even out of uniform, combined with the fabricated radio call, was enough. Just then, the distant wail of sirens, faint but unmistakable, cut through the drumming rain. Sergeant Jenkins. David's heart gave a leap of relief. She was here. Cutter's eyes widened in genuine terror. "Let's go," he snarled to his men. Without another word, they turned and fled. Scrambling through a back exit David hadn't noticed, disappearing into the dark, rainy night. David didn't pursue them. His focus was solely on Ethan. Ethan. He had slumped against a rusty pillar, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The dark stain on his jacket had spread. His eyes, wide with shock, were fixed on David. He had witnessed David risking everything for him, his safety, his career, his life. The hardened facade, built over 2 decades of resentment and abandonment, finally crumbled, replaced by a raw, profound mixture of disbelief, relief, and an overwhelming gratitude. David quickly knelt beside him, checking his pulse, his breathing. "Ethan," he said, his voice softer now, devoid of its earlier command. "Are you all right? What happened?" He saw the small, shallow stab wound in Ethan's side, likely from a struggle before David arrived. Ethan looked at him, his lips trembling, unable to form words. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, began to stream down his face, washing away the dirt and the grime. "Davy," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, the name a painful echo from their distant childhood. You came back. You saved me." It wasn't just physical salvation, it was emotional, spiritual. He saw the younger brother who had always looked up to him, now grown into a protector, a rescuer. The years of resentment, the bitterness, seemed to melt away in that single, profound moment of raw recognition. Just then, the screech of tires outside signaled the arrival of patrol cars. Sergeant Jenkins, her face grim with concern, burst through the warehouse door, followed by a team of uniformed officers, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. She saw David kneeling over Ethan, a small handgun discarded on the floor nearby. She saw the relief, the raw emotion on David's face, the vulnerability she had never witnessed before. She saw Ethan, broken and bleeding, looking at David with a gaze that spoke volumes of a shared, deep connection. Sergeant Jenkins's expression softened. She didn't question David's presence, didn't demand explanations. Her eyes, filled with profound understanding and a quiet approval, simply acknowledged the scene. She had known David held a painful past, but seeing this raw, unscripted reunion, the bond of brotherhood so evident, solidified her understanding. The vindication was not just for David's actions tonight, but for the inherent goodness of his heart, his unwavering loyalty to family, a loyalty that transcended duty and protocol. He had stepped out of the shadows, and in saving his brother, he had, perhaps, saved a part of himself too. The brotherhood, long fractured, was beginning to be forged anew in the crucible of this dangerous rainy night. The flashing lights of patrol cars painted the old industrial warehouse in a stark, pulsating tableau of red and blue. The rain, relentless moments ago, had tapered off to a persistent drizzle, as if the heavens themselves were taking a moment of quiet reflection after the storm. Sergeant Sarah Jenkins moved with practiced efficiency, directing her officers, her gaze occasionally drifting to David and Ethan. A silent acknowledgement of the profound personal drama that had just unfolded. Paramedics were already attending to Ethan's stab wound, their movements calm and professional amidst the lingering tension. Cutter and his two enforcers, located attempting to hide in a dilapidated section of the warehouse, were apprehended without further incident. They were hardened criminals, but the unexpected intervention by David, followed by the sudden arrival of numerous police units, had shattered their nerve. They offered little resistance, their bravado evaporating into sullen resignation. The white powder Cutter had held, along with other incriminating evidence, was secured by evidence technicians. The subsequent investigation and legal proceedings against Cutter's crew were swift, driven by the compelling evidence David had gathered discreetly, combined with Ethan's eventual, albeit reluctant, testimony. The network of low-level drug dealing and extortion that had plagued the industrial district was dismantled. Cutter and his men faced severe charges, leading to their swift conviction and incarceration. Their reign of petty terror was over. Their justice served by the very system Ethan had once fled and David had upheld. The fall of these antagonists was absolute. Their crimes met with due legal consequence. Ethan, once his physical wounds were stabilized, was taken to the hospital for further treatment. David, having given his preliminary statement to Sergeant Jenkins, found himself sitting beside Ethan's hospital bed hours later. The room was sterile, silent save for the soft beeping of medical equipment. Ethan was asleep, the pain medication having finally brought him some peace. David watched him, tracing the lines of hardship on his brother's face, a face so familiar, yet so profoundly altered. The morning after the warehouse raid, David had a private, intense conversation with Sergeant Jenkins in her office. She listened patiently as he recounted the full story, from the locket to the traffic stop, to his desperate, off-duty pursuit. He laid bare his vulnerabilities, his long-held guilt, his almost irrational need to save his brother. Sergeant Jenkins, her expression unreadable at first, finally leaned back in her chair, a sigh escaping her lips. "David," she said, her voice soft but firm. "What you did, it was reckless. You put yourself at risk, outside of protocol. You could have been killed. You could have lost your badge." David met her gaze unflinching. "I know, Sergeant, but I couldn't just let him go. Not again." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then a subtle, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "No," she agreed. "I suppose you couldn't. Sometimes the law isn't enough. Is it? Sometimes a man has to choose between what's right and what's written in the rule book." She paused, her eyes softening. "You're a good man, David, a damn good officer, and a better brother, it seems, than you gave yourself credit for." She didn't reprimand him, didn't threaten him with disciplinary action. Instead, she offered her support, discreetly, subtly. "Ethan's got a long road ahead," she said. "The legal issues, the addiction, the physical recovery, it's not going to be easy." She then mentioned a network of social services and rehabilitation programs she knew of, reputable ones that worked with individuals struggling with addiction and homelessness. They can help him, David, if he's willing. This was her concrete action, her way of becoming his helper in Ethan's journey, seeing the inherent goodness in Ethan's potential for change. Ethan's journey to recovery was indeed arduous. He faced charges for minor infractions related to his transient lifestyle and involvement with Cutter's crew. But David's full account, combined with Sergeant Jenkins's quiet influence, ensured that the focus remained on rehabilitation rather than punitive measures. Ethan accepted full responsibility for his past mistakes. He admitted to his drug addiction, his flight from responsibility, and the resentment he had harbored. This marked the beginning of his genuine path to recovery, a difficult but necessary step towards healing. With David's quiet support and the resources subtly provided by Sergeant Jenkins, Ethan entered a reputable rehabilitation program, a quiet facility nestled in the countryside outside Fairview. It was a place where he could heal physically and emotionally, away from the temptations and dangers of his past life. While Ethan was in rehab, David visited him regularly. These visits were awkward at first, filled with long silences and hesitant words. They began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding their brotherly bond. They talked about their childhood, not just the good memories, but the painful ones. They aired out old grievances, the misunderstandings that had fractured their family years ago. Ethan spoke of his resentment, his feeling of abandonment after their parents' deaths, his belief that David had chosen the law over him. "I thought you just forgot about me, Davy," Ethan confessed one afternoon, his voice raw. "That you were better off without me. I saw you as the one who escaped, who made it out, and I hated you for it, for leaving me behind." David listened, his heart aching. He, in turn, spoke of his own pain, his youthful fear after Ethan disappeared, his desperate attempts to find order in a chaotic world. "I never forgot you, Ethan. Not for a single day. I tried to find you, but I didn't know how. I built walls, Ethan, to protect myself from losing anyone else. I thought I was strong, but I was just hiding." The conversations were difficult, often painful, but necessary. Each shared memory, each spoken truth, chipped away at the resentment and misunderstanding that had festered for 2 decades. They talked about their parents, about the pressures they had faced growing up. They laughed at old inside jokes, shed tears over shared losses. The opportunity wasn't material wealth. It was the chance to heal their family, to rediscover the brotherhood they had lost. As Ethan slowly recovered, physically and emotionally, he began to help out at the rehab facility, sharing his story with others who were struggling. He discovered a knack for connecting with people, for offering empathy and understanding, strengths he hadn't realized he possessed. David, watching his brother transform, felt a deep peace settling within him. A peace he hadn't known was missing. The burden he had carried for so long, the ghost of a lost brother, was finally lifting. One evening, after a particularly long and honest conversation with Ethan, David found himself back in his own kitchen, making a simple dinner. Sergeant Jenkins, having finished her shift, called him. "How's he doing, David?" she asked, her voice warm. "He's good, Sergeant. Really good. Making progress every day." David smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything." "Don't thank me, David." She chuckled softly. "You did the heavy lifting. You opened your heart. That's the hardest part." She paused. "You know, this whole thing, it's changed you." "David." "How so?" David asked, stirring his pasta. "You used to be all about the rules, the black and white. Now you see the gray. You see the human behind the uniform, behind the crime. You're still disciplined, still by the book when it counts. But there's a warmth about you now, an empathy. It makes you a better officer. David, a more complete man." David considered her words. He looked around his meticulously neat kitchen. It was still orderly, still clean, but it no longer felt empty. He had faced the chaos of his past, not just in the derelict warehouse, but within himself. And in doing so, he had found a new kind of order, one that included compassion, vulnerability, and the profound, enduring power of family. The new calm had settled, not as a return to his old life, but as a beginning of a profoundly different, more fulfilling one. The bridges were being rebuilt, brick by painful, hopeful brick. Chapter 8. The Unbroken Connection, word count 2470. 2 years later, the quiet suburban town of Fairview felt less like a backdrop for Officer David Miller's ordered life, and more like a vibrant, living entity he was deeply intertwined with. His house, once a testament to his disciplined solitude, now hummed with a different kind of order, the comfortable chaos of a home truly lived in. The stark, minimalist decor had softened, replaced by framed photographs of shared moments. A dog-eared book left open on the coffee table, and the lingering scent of freshly baked cookies from his once empty kitchen. David's personal life, once meticulously compartmentalized and emotionally distant, was now richer, more balanced. He still maintained his methodical routines, a core part of his being, but they no longer served as a shield against the world. Instead, they provided a stable foundation upon which he built a life filled with genuine connection. He hosted regular family dinners, usually with his sister Clara and her growing family, and often with Ethan. His house felt like a home, filled with warmth and the comforting sounds of laughter and shared stories. Ethan, now 38, was a testament to the power of second chances and unwavering support. He was clean, his eyes clear and bright, free from the haunted weariness that had once defined them. He had excelled in his rehabilitation program, embracing every step of the journey with a quiet determination David recognized as a shared trait. He was steadily employed as a lead mechanic at a reputable garage, his natural talent for working with machines finally finding a constructive outlet. Beyond his job, Ethan had found a new purpose. He volunteered regularly at a local shelter for individuals experiencing homelessness and addiction, sharing his story not as a cautionary tale, but as an inspiration. He mentored new residents, his lived experience giving his words a weight and authenticity that resonated deeply. He was paying it forward, transforming his past struggles into a beacon of hope for others. Their brotherly bond, once fractured and seemingly beyond repair, had not just mended, it had been reforged in the crucible of adversity, stronger and more resilient than ever before. Ethan was a frequent, welcome presence in David's life, their once awkward conversations now flowing easily, filled with understanding and a deep, unspoken love. They still argued sometimes, small, insignificant brotherly squabbles, but they were quickly resolved, always ending with a shared laugh or a knowing glance. David, inspired by Ethan's transformation and his own journey of empathy, had begun to use his experience to advocate for meaningful change within the police department. He spearheaded a new initiative, passionately championing programs focused on rehabilitation and community support rather than just punitive measures for nonviolent offenders, particularly those struggling with addiction or homelessness. He believed that the uniform should not just represent authority, but also compassion and understanding. He organized workshops, brought in experts, and shared Ethan's story with Ethan's permission. Of course, keeping identities anonymous for official purposes as a powerful case study for the human cost of purely punitive approaches. His influence within the force grew, not just because of his efficiency, but because of his newfound empathy, which made him a more complete and respected leader. Sergeant Jenkins, a steady and supportive presence, was his fiercest advocate, quietly guiding him through the bureaucratic maze. The true impact of their journey was not measured in career advancements or social accolades, but in the quiet moments of shared life. One warm summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft lavender, David and Ethan sat side by side on a weathered wooden dock at a quiet, secluded lake on the outskirts of Fairview. The water was still, reflecting the dying light like a vast, rippling canvas. Fishing rods lay propped beside them, their lines cast lazily into the water. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore and the distant croaking of frogs. They didn't need to speak much. The silence between them was not the empty, strained silence of 2 decades ago, but a comfortable, understanding quiet, filled with the unspoken language of shared history and profound connection. Ethan pulled a small, intricately carved wooden fish from his pocket, a gift he had made for David, a symbol of their shared love for the lake they had discovered as children. David took it, his fingers tracing the smooth, cool wood. "Remember that time?" Ethan began, his voice low, a soft smile playing on his lips. "When you swore you caught the biggest catfish in the lake, but it turned out to be just an old boot." David chuckled, a genuine, warm sound. "And you swore you'd seen a mermaid. Ethan, we were both pretty wild back then." Ethan nudged him gently with his elbow. "Yeah, we were." He paused, his gaze fixed on the shimmering water. "Glad we found our way back. Davy." David looked at his brother, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the sunset. He didn't need to say anything. A subtle, knowing glance passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the long, winding road they had traveled, the depths of despair they had plumbed, and the profound joy of their reunion. The locket, no longer hidden in a drawer but worn discreetly around David's neck, is a subtle reminder of the past, now healed and integrated into the present. Ethan's presence, a strong, vibrant force beside him, was the ultimate vindication of every risk David had taken, every wall he had dismantled. Their bond, unbreakable now, was the true triumph, a quiet symphony of joy. If this story stirred your heart, if it reminds you that courage can alter destinies and that light always finds a path even in the deepest darkness, please leave a comment. Share this story with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss our upcoming stories.